All right, good morning, Facebook family and friends. This is your favorite Sunday school teacher, third vice president of Usher Board number 4, New Zion Missionary Baptist Church, coming to you from Rockford, Illinois. Today, we have a special guest that we're going to be introducing in a moment. But for right now, we're asking you to come on in and check in to this digital class. You might be watching this later on in the day or later on in the week, but we still would appreciate you interacting with us in the comment section by, first of all, letting us know how you're doing this morning. If you could type it in with one word or phrase, how are you faring this morning? We want to do a mental, emotional check-in. Just like when you get up in the morning, you ought to stretch and sort of make sure everything is working right, or check yourself out to see if you need some help in a certain area because maybe you overstrained it. We want you to do that emotionally and mentally right now. Let us know how you're feeling. Let us know what's going on in your life. We do this as a measure of good mental hygiene, learning how to, first of all, identify ourselves so that we can adjust the thermostat as needed. So the second thing you're going to do, even as you come in, and I'm grateful for those of you who are joining us as you do every Sunday morning right on time. Second thing we want you to do is to reflect on the best thing that happened to you this past week. The reason we're asking you to do that is because you have agency. You can decide to rejoice in the Lord. You can decide to reflect on his goodness and his grace, regardless of how you might be feeling right now. The psalmist says, I'll bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make her boast in the Lord. The humble will hear thereof and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. For this poor man cried out, and he delivered me from all my fears. See, what he's doing there is he's reflecting on God's past goodness so that regardless of what's going on in his life at that moment of writing, he can regulate himself. So adjust the thermostat right quick. However you're feeling right now, let's reflect on the best thing that God did for you this past week, the blessings that you received. Go ahead and take a moment to type that in. And while you're doing that, let me prepare to get out of the way. I've been promising for a while now. Literally, I think at the beginning of the year, I promised that sometime before the end of the year, we were going to have our guests come. And by God's grace, the schedules have aligned and God has brought him here safely. This year, we've been trying to discuss things that we don't talk about in church that much. I believe at the beginning of the year, we started out with money, and then we talked about food and eating and how that impacts our spirituality. We've gone through a whole lot of things. Even, I believe, the last few weeks, we've been talking about the care and feeding of the pastor, proper care and feeding of the pastor's wife. And now, finally, as a part of our ongoing series on intimacy that we've been working through here this fall, I promised that eventually we were going to get to the issue of sex. And here it is, by God's grace. I've imposed upon one of my great friends to come and to share with us some insights from the Word of God as we delve into that topic that we don't talk about enough in church, if we talk about it at all. And so we want you to get your hot beverage, get yourself propped up in the bed or wherever you're at the kitchen table. We want you to get ready to take some notes and to interact with us in the comment section should you have any questions or comments. So if you've done everything I've asked you to do, if you've checked in, and as you're checking in, go ahead and give a shout out to the church that you belong to. If you don't belong to New Zion, give a shout out to your pastor and your first lady. We want you to let us know how you're doing today, best thing that happened to you this past week, and then give us a shout out where you're logging in from. We're always glad to see our friends from across the country as they're interacting with us. And then I want you to be prayerful and let the Lord speak to you today as our great friend Dr. Jeremy Meeks, all the way from Chicago, Illinois, is going to interact with us and share from the Word of God some of the insights God has given him as it relates to. I gave him a wide open field. I told him that he can approach it however he wants. He can talk about whatever he wants to talk about, long as he's talking about sex. And so that's what we're going to do today from a biblical perspective. So get your seatbelts on, get something to write with, get something to write on. And I want you to welcome our guest, Dr. Jeremy Meeks, as he comes to share with us today. Have at it.
Thank you. Hello. Welcome. If you have a hot beverage, just know this, you might spit on yourself and burn yourself this morning. So get ready. It's a joy to be here. Thank you, Pastor Copeland, for inviting me to talk about this topic. This is going to be the first in a series, the best I understand. I won't be doing a series, but I get to kick the series off talking about this important topic, moving from intimacy in general to sexual intimacy in particular. Now, I want to begin by answering a question. Essentially, this entire hour is structured to answer this question. A question maybe you're asking, some of you are probably asking, and all of you should be asking, which is this: is something like this necessary? Like, is it really necessary to take time in church to talk about things we don't talk about in church? Now, you might think, well, yeah, sure, when it comes to money or mental health, but really, sex? Now, I could just spend the next hour just reading the Bible, talking about, quoting passages that talk about sex, or give us narratives that involve lots of sex. The reality is the Bible is way more full of sex than most of us can possibly imagine. I think one of the reasons is because it's such an important part of many humans' lives, and it's such a confusing topic. Today's culture seems to be inundated with sex. We use it to sell everything from cars to careers. But the reality is that we've never been more confused about the topic. So what I want to do in this time is something that, let me fully confess, sounds absolutely boring. Like more boring than you could possibly imagine. Which is give you a summary of my doctoral dissertation. How you feeling about that? I'm sure that you're thinking, I got up early in the morning for this. I got up early in the morning to see my favorite Sunday school teacher, Dr. Copeland, and now I'm staring at another human being talking about a doctoral dissertation. I'm going back to bed. But before you turn this off, just let me give you the question that I'm trying to answer in my dissertation, and we'll see how boring it is. I'll read it for you. I'll quote it. Here it goes. How does St. Augustine reorient the contemporary conflicting debates about the use of robots for sex? It's a real question. It's a real thing. And I'm going to try and help us understand not only what the heck the answer to that question is, but why it matters for people like you and me. Why it matters for the church. Now, I want this to be as practical as it is informative. The reason why we're starting here to talk about sexual intimacy, again, is to answer the question, why is this so important to talk about in church? Now, I want to answer that question in a weird way. I want to go all the way to the edge of kind of the human imagination to demonstrate why talking about something like this is so important. So here's the outline. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about what the heck is a sex robot. I want to talk about why it matters, and why it matters especially for the church. Looking at what Augustine would have us do in response to this situation. Especially the different kinds of arguments, pro and con, that exist out there, and how Augustine reorients those kinds of conversations for the church. It's going to be a lot of information, I promise you. If you're coming to church this morning and you got a question that you want to ask me that you want to put on Facebook, I get it, first of all. And second of all, I'd be happy to answer any question you have. I'll also say this before I start. Don't Google the things that I'm talking about. If you do that, that's on you. That's not on me. I gave you fair warning. I'll give you another warning going forward. Don't Google this stuff. Also, I'm sorry, because you'll probably see it pop up in the news and everything like that. People are like, I've never heard about this before. All of a sudden we talk about it and our phones are listening to us all the time, and you'll get stuff popping up on your phone. So, let's talk about it. What the heck is a sex robot? That's kind of our first point. the first chapter of my dissertation. What a sex robot is simply this: a social robot used for sexual gratification. You go, okay, well, now I have more questions. What the heck is a social robot? Well, a social robot, let's talk about what a robot is to begin with. A robot is kind of any machine that we use for tasks that are ordinarily dull, dangerous, dumb. Think of like those big kind of mechanical arms that are used in the fabrication of cars. You've probably seen a commercial. Those big things that kind of dunk the whole body of a car into some kind of paint or something like that. Those are what we usually think of as robots in the industrial setting, and they're hugely effective and also rather disruptive to human economies. There's lots of questions even about those kinds of robots. So most of us think about that when we think of robots, but then also like social robots are those kinds of robots that exist in kind of everyday human space. So you can think about probably the most common example of this is one of those Roombas. All right, the little circular disc that just kind of goes around and cleans your floors. Now, the reason why it's a social robot, even though it doesn't look like a human or talk to you or anything like that, is because it takes up space in human society. I can prove to you how seductive these robots are and how powerful they are by just simply pointing out that maybe you have one of these in your home, or maybe you've been to somebody's home that has one. But when that robot gets stuck in a corner or something, people tend to freak out. They go, oh no, we got to help the robot. But they don't call it the robot. Usually, people will call it him or her. Usually even name it and give it a human name. Not only that, but they will modify their entire house to make sure that the robot can go up a level or down a level. They'll modify their entire space just so that a little disc can go around and suck up stuff that's on the floor. Now, there's nothing wrong with a Roomba. If you've got one, you shouldn't start to like beat it with a hammer or anything if you've got one at home. But just know this, that's how powerful even something like a black disc going around on the ground just to vacuum your floors can be. When I'm talking about a social robot used for sexual gratification, it doesn't have to look like a human. You can kind of let your imagination go wild. In fact, there's people who say, like, we should avoid any form of it looking like a human because there's all kinds of problems associated with that, some of which we're about to get into. So they think about, like, blankets, kind of, you can just kind of drape over your body and use that for sexual gratification, something like that. But the reality is, you and I love things that look human. We can't explain it. This isn't even a Christian thing. We just know this from kind of observation. There have been experiments done on robots that kind of look like an old school erector set, that have this really robotic voice, that has the bare minimum of human features. It just has eyes and a mouth. And it kind of talks. But you can clearly see the whole thing is just mechanical and has this robot voice. What they found was if you put eyebrows on that thing that move very basically to kind of move with what a human would do with their eyebrows during human speech, then the rapidity with which a human being attributes personhood to that thing skyrockets. All it was some eyebrows. You take the eyebrows away and everybody kind of goes, okay, well, I kind of like this thing. But the minute you just put eyebrows that move, it goes through the roof. People go, oh, I have a relationship with this thing. This thing clearly seems to be communicating with me. The fact of the matter is, you and I as human beings can't help but attribute human characteristics to non-human things. It's part of being human. It's one of the weird things that we do. If you want proof of this, just think about your phone. Now, I don't know what you look like on the other side of this technological device, but I guarantee you that you don't look exactly like a phone. But think about the relationship you have with your phone. Maybe you've named it, maybe you haven't. But your phone is essentially a partner with you in much of life. And don't get me wrong, my phone is the only reason why I probably showed up here this morning. Because it woke me up, it gave me directions. They're very beneficial devices. But there's a real question out there, which is, are our phones making us stupid? The reason why we have those questions is because we invest so much time, effort, and energy into our phones. Now imagine if the technology that was in your phone was in a social robot that moved and spoke like a human, wasn't a human, but moved and spoke like a human, at least enough so that you would have the inclination to treat it like a human being. What if you could have sex with that thing? Question, do those things actually exist? Answer, kind of. The whole speaking like a human being exists on a rudimentary level, but it's getting better every single day. We can't get it to move like a human being yet, mainly because, this is one of the interesting things, God created human beings in a very interesting and unique way. We can walk upright very well, and you think, well, that's not a big deal until you get something like vertigo. All it is, to my understanding, I'm not a doctor, but it's just like pressure buildup in your ears. But when that happens to a sufficient degree, you can't even walk straight. And that's all because there's some kind of like internal gyroscope you got going on. Well, to put that into a robot is very complicated. So are we going to have them? Probably. But we don't need them to be like you see in the movies where they look exactly like a human being, mainly because a human being is playing the robot. We just need them to be human enough. Because again, going back to the whole idea with our phones or like a Roomba, we have a willingness and a tendency to want the robot to be human. I think part of that's because you and I are creative creatures created in God's image to be creative. And so with that creativity, sometimes that creativity goes off the rails. But why is this like a important religious thing? Here's why. I'm going to explain this too, but I think that a sex robot serves as a relic, a religious relic, of a folk religion that you and I are tempted to buy into every single day of our lives. That folk religion is consumerism. So let me just say this. How is consumerism a folk religion? Consumerism, to begin with, is just the kind of idea that you and I find happiness in what we own, that we find our identity in what we own, or what we could own if we so desired to own it. This is the whole kind of keeping up with the Joneses idea. Now you think, okay, well that's kind of consumerism, this idea to always want something more, to always kind of identify ourselves by what we have. It's kind of the basis of American society, really the basis of all kind of first world countries. And if you're not first world, the other worlds, just so you know, just want to be like the first world. But why is it religious? Well, think about it. It's got its own temples and its own prophets. Now, I said it's a folk religion because it's not fixedly established. In this place, we have a building called a church, and there is a pastor, there's deacons, there's all kinds of official roles. But in a folk religion, you have kind of things like that, but aren't exactly necessarily firmly established. But they do have their prophets, and they do have their temples. The temples are called malls and Amazon.com, and their prophets are called social media influencers. What do you think they're doing? They're just trying to get you to buy stuff. But not just buy stuff to have stuff, but buy stuff to have stuff to be a different kind of person. And the beauty of consumerism is you can be whatever you can buy, or whatever you wish you could buy. Think about when it comes to consumerism, it has very kind of religious aspects to it. It has its own symbols. So in Christianity, we have stuff like the cross or the baptismal font. Well, in consumerism, you have, I could just draw them right now, and you would name them very quickly. But you have like, the Mercedes-Benz logo or the Nike swoosh. These all function as symbols that identify you with certain parts of that religious makeup. It has its own evangelistic techniques. One of the interesting things about the evangelism of consumerism is that it convinces you to buy into it by exclusivity. In other words, it demonstrates that you're not part of the club yet, but you could be if you just had a little bit more money or did a little bit more to get that money, which is why we have some brands that are unattainable. They're the same as everything else, but people will literally work themselves to death just to try and get those things. That's the form of evangelism. Christianity, by the way, is interesting in that it's also evangelistic, but in the opposite way, in that it is an evangelism to everybody. And the good news is that everybody can get in, regardless of who you are. But it's still evangelistic. But the thing that's probably most intriguing in kind of the religious realm with both of these, both like Christianity and consumerism, is this. Is that they are both radically, this is a 25-cent word for the day, ready? Radically eschatological. Which means that they are both radically bent towards the end of everything. Consumerism's eschatology is this. Happiness is right around the corner. Happiness being everything you've always wanted forever. It's right around the corner. You just have to buy one more thing. You can have it in this life. It's the feeling that you get for about 5 minutes when you get a new car. You drive it off the lot and you think, I am the greatest human that has ever lived. Now, all you did was put yourself in debt. You're not that great of a person. But for some crazy reason, we have gamed ourselves into thinking that I am great because of this situation that I've placed myself in. We're happy for a minute. But Christianity also has an eschatology. It also believes that there is happiness around the corner. Again, everything you've always wanted for all time. The difference between consumerism and Christianity is that Christianity says, oh, but that corner is the end of everything. That you actually will never be happy, have everything you want forever, until you die. Consumerism, right now, just got to buy one more thing. Christianity, never going to be fully yours. So these are competing religions. I said a sex robot functions like a relic of that religion. How does that work? Well, as we're about to see, the sex robot functions as a relic, a powerful relic, because it gives you, hypothetically, everything you've always wanted, forever, whenever you want it, however you want it. Essentially, you get to create your own universe with the robot. It's a high relic of the religion of consumerism. So that's what a sex robot is. Again, we'll probably have something like them. We will definitely be seduced into using them. By we, I just mean human beings. But I wouldn't leave out Christians from this. We'll get to why in a minute. And most of all, these things are religious. That's why I'm actually going to use Augustine. So let's talk about Augustine for a minute. Who was Augustine, very briefly, and why use him? Augustine was a professional public speaker in the 4th century, brilliant beyond anybody's wildest imagination, who became a Christian in a rather strange kind of way. God just kind of like Paul in Acts 7, just kind of knocked him out of the blue and claimed him for himself. It was a pretty radical conversion. You can read about it, by the way, in a book called Confessions, which I'd encourage you to read. It's an interesting book. It's just Augustine, his Confessions. It's really written as a prayer to God, reflecting on his life and how God brought him to faith. And he's writing as kind of everyman, thinking that his story is very similar to the story of how God works generally in all of us. As he becomes a Christian, he also becomes a bishop, and very quickly he becomes one of the most prominent Christians in the world because of his ability to think well about hard topics. Augustine lived at a very unique time. Augustine had no idea what a robot was. Augustine had no idea about anything that I'm talking about. But his time was very similar to our time in 3 respects. His was a similar sexual time as ours. It was a very confused time, and it was a time full of people who were debating about the virtue of sex and how it worked. For example, part of Roman society. We're talking late Rome. After the Greeks, the Romans thought they were better than the Greeks because the Greeks were kind of rather wildly sexually deviant. And the Romans were like, we're not going to be like that. We're going to have like a well-ordered sexual society. The way that they established that well-ordered sexual society was to have literally innumerable numbers of slaves who were used as essentially sexual receptacles. They could be used that way because they didn't count as human beings. So, quick example. Fathers would encourage their sons to use slaves for sex because if they didn't do that, they would go after free-born Roman women and cause problems, especially if those were married women. So the encouragement was, just go use the slaves. They're not human. It was a similar sexual time, as we'll see, to our own. Second, it was a similar time in that Augustine was dealing with a church trying to figure out how to deal with the world around it. There was two big schools when it came to kind of dealing with the world. There was the school that said everything in the world is awful and you just have to cut yourself off from everything. And on the other side, there were those who were saying the world is great and you can do anything you want. You just have to harness your own will, and if you have enough willpower, you can deal with anything. And this is a major debate in the 4th century in the church. And Augustine comes along and says, you're both wrong. God created the world is good, yet human beings in their fallen condition, we can't just harness our own wills and do whatever we want. So how is it that we live in the world appreciating the good gifts of God without believing that we can just do whatever we want? He also dealt not only with a sexually similar time as our own, and a similar time as far as what we should be involved with, but third, he also dealt with what God is, a time in which everybody was confused about what God is doing in the world. Boy, are we there now. What is God up to in this moment in time? The vast majority of Christians in the 4th century, living under the Roman Empire, thought that the kingdom of God was right around the corner. Augustine wasn't so sure. Augustine wasn't fully despairing, but Augustine thought there's no way for you and I, as human beings, to know what God is up to in the world. We can't know unless God has told us explicitly in His Word. We just don't know what God is doing. There's lots of questions today, too. What's God doing? You see something like sex robots, and you think, oh no, that's it. This is the end of Western civilization. There are both religious and secular people who say such a thing. There are other people who say, well, it's the end maybe of Western civilization as we know it, but we're getting something much better. We'll see what Augustine would have to say to us and how he would have us live. He's very helpful in, again, reorienting the conversation. Because we're about to see the pro and con arguments are in an intractable position. They're absolutely diametrically opposed ends. What I want to show is how Augustine would split the middle in these kinds of conversations and reorient the conversation in a way that's very helpful for the church. Because believe it or not, I believe that sex robots are a unique opportunity for the church to live in a particular kind of way, in lots of different ways, but particularly in regard to sexual intimacy. So let's go through them. The three kind of major ways of categorizing the current arguments for and against the use of robots for sex. Congratulations. If you're still on here, and I don't know if anybody's watching this, but that's all right. But if anybody's on here, you've made it to chapter 3 of my dissertation. I told you this wasn't boring. All right, way number 1 is freedom. Who doesn't love freedom? Everybody loves freedom, right? So let's go with the pro argument, the pro-sex robot argument. Here it is. It's simple as this. Humans ought to be maximally free. In other words, we ought to be as free as we could possibly be with the bare minimum of government intervention into our lives. We should be as free to do whatever we want, as much as we want, with whomever we want. Now, of course, government has a role to play, but they should play a bare minimum of a role, and sex robots are a great way to be incredibly free. We can do whatever we want with them. They look human. We can kind of deceive ourselves that they're human. But that's my free choice if I decided to do that. I can do whatever I want. And so the government should get out of the way, and you should get out of the way, and I should get out of the way. If I want to use a sex robot, I could just do it that if I want. I'm maximally free. And it'll be especially great for two reasons. First, because I can own it. It's mine. It provides, here's another 25-cent word for the day, ontological security. In other words, I can be confident in my being in the world because I own this thing that's my partner, especially my sexual partner, and it'll never go away. One of the reasons why some people are afraid to get into relationships is because they know that the other person is going to die. And newsflash, y'all are going to die. So am I. So what if you could have a relationship with something that would never die? That seems like it'd be pretty great. You could own it. The second way in which you could be maximally free with this thing is that you could also make it whatever you want. Literally. You can make the robot whatever you want today. Sexual desires change over time. It's one of the reasons we tell people wrongly in our society that they shouldn't get married when they're young, because y'all are going to change. You all change the minute you get married, regardless of whether you get married at like 18 or 80. The minute you get married, you're changed. So you're always going to change. Hopefully that comes up in one of these Sunday school lessons. Like, that's why you always marry the wrong person. That point's just for free, by the way. Everybody always marries the wrong person. The reason why is because there is no right person. So again, that has nothing to do with today, but you just take that, put it in your back pocket. That's for free. You didn't have to pay anything for that one. Just God bless you. So the reason why is because you always marry somebody other than who you got together with, because then you get married. But what if the problem is with the other person is you can't always just like force them to be whoever you want them to be. Like my wife, for example, she did change me, mainly because I was mostly like feral. Like, I was a wild animal when we got married. And so she was like, you should take your clothes, and instead of putting them on the floor, you should put them in the hamper. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. I had piles of clothes. I had like dirtiest to lesser dirty to kind of, I think these might be clean. And then I would just kind of shove the line towards the washing machine until my mom was like, okay, that's it. We can't do this anymore. God bless my wife. So she did have an influence on me for good, but she couldn't make me whatever I wanted. For example, she couldn't make me 6'4", or she couldn't make me look like I was from Sri Lanka or something, depending on the day and her desires. Well, with the sex robot, you can do exactly that. You can make it whatever you want, whenever you want it. It's a way to be free. You don't have to worry about things like consent. You just use it whenever you want it. It's a great way to be free. And of course, the argument from the pro side is that this is important because you shouldn't do that with a human being, but you can do it with a robot. That's the pro side. Here's the con side. Con side, and maybe you're already sitting there like yelling at, you're spilling your coffee all over yourself in bed, you're yelling at Facebook. Don't worry, we'll get you. Here it is. Here's the con side. It should be coming up in your mind already. And the good news is, by the way, folks, is that these arguments are mostly from non-Christians on the con side. They go, okay, hold on. So owning something that looks like a human, that you treat like a human, that you have sex with like a human, boy, that sounds like slavery. Owning that thing. That doesn't sound like something we should go back to. That was problematic, and let's just avoid that altogether. Let's not do that. That doesn't sound like it's freeing. Now, it's not the robot that we're concerned about. We're concerned about the person who owns the robot. It doesn't sound freeing for the owner, because now you're putting that person in the position of owning a thing. It also doesn't seem very freeing for all the other human beings, because while you want to be maximally free, owning something that looks like a human, treating like a human, that forces me to live in that society too. That doesn't seem very freeing. As far as you get to use it for sex however you want, whenever you want, I thought, says the con people, I thought that consent was a good thing. Consent's an incredibly complicated thing. And how to know that you've arrived at consent. I'm not even talking like outside of marriage, I'm talking inside marriage too. It's a real important kind of debate that people are having in the world right now. But if you just have a robot that doesn't have any measure of consent or anything like that, then aren't we just creating a world where people get used to having sex with whomever they want, whenever they want, however they want? That doesn't seem like it's real good for society. So maybe it's not actually freeing. Maybe the sex robot itself is enslaving. What saith Augustine? Augustine comes down and shoots right through kind of the middle of both of these arguments. It says freedom is great. You want to be free, I want to be free. Every human's always wanted to be free. Freedom is awesome. Maximally free. Let's go for it. However, it is true that consent and slavery are important topics. We should avoid slavery and we should pursue consent. Maybe we have the wrong understanding of freedom. And maybe freedom isn't doing whatever we want or the ability to do whatever we want. Maybe freedom is the ability to do whatever God wants. That's how Augustine will understand freedom. Why? Well, if God creates human beings and then gives them the way in which to live in the kind of way that God desires for humans to live is the way to be most fully free and most fully human. So, you and I should desire to live the way God desires us to live. Friend, don't you have like some experience of that in your life? That though it's not easy, doing what God wants you to do in the world, as revealed in His Word, leads to an incredible amount of freedom. Let me give you an example of this. Real kind of simple example. When you read in the Bible that God desires for us to obey those who are in authority, and because of that, you then wear your seatbelt when you drive, isn't it a freeing thing when you actually wear that seatbelt? Or when you see the red lights flash behind you, or the blue lights flash behind you? At least in regard to the seatbelt. Because you were wearing your seatbelt, you're exposed to. You're like, well, I'm not going to get a seatbelt ticket. Now, some of you are thinking like, well, they pulled me over for speeding. Well, there you go. See, you should have gone the speed limit as well. And when you're not going the speed limit, you're always looking around you like you robbed a bank or something. You're trying to watch on like, Waze or whatever to see how many people like hit the fact there's a speed trap up here and all that kind of stuff. But if you just drive the speed limit, you don't have that part of driving to worry about. Or when you wear your seatbelt, you don't have that part of driving to worry about. You can be as completely free as you want to kind of sing whatever kind of songs you want in the car and have a great old time. But when you don't, then all of a sudden you just got that thing in the back of your head like, man, I hope a cop doesn't pull me over. At least in regard to that aspect of driving. Because you're obeying the rules. Augustine would say, well, when you live God's way, you can be free. What that results in for the church is kind of a disciplined community. It doesn't mean that we lack freedom. It means we lack absolute freedom within the bounds that God has given us to live in. So, for example, let's think about sex for a second. God goes, get married and go wild. Now, let me admit, and this should be a future conversation in the Sunday school series, not everybody who is a Christian is experiencing the kinds of freedom in sex that people ought to be experiencing who are Christians. Something to talk about. But what God does at least is He kind of, imagine a soccer field at the edge of a cliff. If there were no walls around the soccer field, then everybody would have to be really careful with what they did with the ball. But if you put up a strong fence, walls around the soccer field, it doesn't matter if the cliff is right on the other side of the wall. If that wall is firm and you go into the court to play soccer, you can go wild. You could play soccer as hard as you wanted to play, having as much fun as you wanted to have because you were inside the fence. The fence isn't enslaving. The fence is helpful to not go over the cliff when you're playing soccer. That's exactly what Augustine is kind of saying when it comes to freedom. God goes, here's the fence. Play inside the fence. Have as much fun as you want inside the fence. This is what freedom looks like. Again, if you think, well, that doesn't sound very freeing, think about playing soccer without the walls. Well, you can still play, but you don't know where the boundaries are. And thus, you're not only less free to play because you don't know where the boundaries are, you're also less free because it's dangerous on every side. So that's freedom. That's the first argument. That's the way that Augustine would help us live. Yeah, be free. But it's not the sex robot you're going after. It's also not just denying the sex robot, but the sex robot gives you an opportunity to go, hold on a second, how is it that we ought to live? Oh, we ought to live within the bounds that God has given us to live as a disciplined community. That's one. What about the second one? The second way of living, or the second kind of group of arguments, is all about companionship. Talk about freedom, now we'll do companionship. Pro side, we'll go pro side. Here's the argument. There are a significant number of people in our society, different kinds of groups, that have difficulty accessing sexual gratification. Just right now, you don't have to put it into comments or anything like that. But just think about like a group of people who have trouble accessing sexual gratification. You got a group in mind? Here we go. Let's name a few groups. Those who are physically or mentally disabled. It's not impossible. I'm not saying anything about impossibility, but they have a harder time sometimes in society to access sexual gratification. Those on the autism spectrum. Those who are pedophiles or have pedophilic inclinations. Those who are in monosexual populations. Think about large development areas, especially in the third world or in the burgeoning world that are drawing people from the third world. Think about places like Dubai, for example. Incredible building infrastructure using mainly poor labor from countries that surround it. Mostly male labor, so these populations are 90% male, 10% female. So predominantly monosexual population. The men have trouble accessing, like it's just a question of math. There's not a whole lot of women around. I could go on naming groups of people. These groups, say the pro people, deserve access to sexual gratification somehow. However much you like the fact, don't like the fact these groups exist, they do exist, so what are we going to do about it? Especially because, as some argue, this is very controversial, that people have like a right to sexual gratification. Now, there's all kinds of challenges to that argument, but if that exists, then man, society's got to do something. And the argument goes on the pro side, using humans to give those people sexual gratification is complicated. Let's just take one example. In Europe, for example, there are people who are paid by the state, function kind of like state-sponsored prostitutes, to give sexual gratification to those who apply to the state for help because they can't find a sexual partner. Usually people who are physically or mentally disabled. It's a program that currently exists, but there's some problems with the program because the question is like, how free are the prostitutes and all this kind of stuff. So some have come along and gone, okay, well, we can avoid all those problems. Why don't we just get sex robots? It's great. That way we can give sexual gratification or provide sexual gratification to these people who are marginalized populations. That's the pro argument, because companionship is important, especially sexual companionship. The con side comes along and goes, okay, those people definitely matter, for sure, no question. But the problem, as we've already established, is that sex robots are deceptive, and they're particularly deceptive for vulnerable populations. Think about it this way. If you have somebody who is already in a marginalized position and already maybe confused about the world that they live in, and you come along with something that kind of looks like a human and kind of acts like a human and go, here, have sex with this thing. The question, by the con side, again, not Christians, is they go, is that really an act of charitable companionship? Or are we essentially saying, look, you're a marginalized human, already on the edges of society. We feel bad for you, so here's a robot, go into the corner and be by yourself. That doesn't seem like it's trying to include them in society. It seems like we're actually trying to shun them from society. Those people matter, but maybe sex robots aren't the best way forward. Augustine comes along and again splits the middle. He goes, okay, there are definitely these kinds of people in society, and they matter. Well, what are we going to do? He says, okay, what's way more important than sexual gratification is friendship. Like legitimate and true friendship. Now, for Augustine, what friendship is loving people in God or toward God. Loving people in God, that includes everybody who's a Christian. So I should love everybody who's a Christian in God. That means I love you because of what God has done for me, and I'm loving you as I have, essentially the love of God pours into me, and I love you because you and I have the love of God in common. It's the way that you stay members of a church and don't leave even though somebody else is a jerk. You love each other in God. But if you don't love each other in God, then the only other way to love somebody is toward God. In other words, you and I don't share the love of God in common, maybe, but I want you to experience the love of God because this is the greatest thing to ever experience. So I want to love you toward God, not just toward me, but toward God. And what that's going to require is to tell you the truth about who God is and what the world is. And that way you and I can experience the love of God in common and have true friendship. This is the way that Augustine will explain that you and I even love our enemies. All our enemies are, for Augustine, are those who are yet to become Christians. Now, Augustine doesn't know if they're going to become Christians, but he's like, that's the way we should view them. As those who I'm loving toward God, because of what God has done for me, with the hopes that they will one day come to share in the love of God that I participate in, because it's the greatest of all things. What does that have to do with the church? Well, the church, on the backside of what Augustine says, is called to be the friendly community. A community that seeks to truly love all people, befriending them in a legitimate kind of way. That primarily looks like telling each other the truth about who God is. We're either reminding each other of who God is or teaching one another for the first time who God is. And as we do that, we then love God and love others in God together. Which means we even love those who are sexually marginalized. Now, this is probably the most controversial part of my dissertation. I mean, the whole thing is kind of scandalous, I'll be perfectly honest with you. But here's essentially what that means. In a very nuanced and wise as serpents and harmless as doves kind of way, the church needs to make room. I'm going to explain what that means. Make room for people who have desires that they can't explain to have sex with children. Let me be clear what that means. That means we do not put them in child care or in charge of child care. But we seek, on an individual basis, with the wisdom that God has given us, to tell them the truth together to love them toward God or in God. Here's the thing you got to understand, friends. There are those who have, in a way that they cannot understand, have desires that they've always had to have sex with underage people. Many of those people have never acted on it. Maybe that's you watching this today. I do believe there are sincere Christians who have those inclinations. The world is broken, friends. It's very attractive to think, well, let's just give them a robot and then, hopefully that'll work and then they won't attack children or ever participate in sex with children. Now, we don't know that's going to work. And if it did work, let me be perfectly honest, that would be a better kind of world. Because we'd see less children harmed. But remember this, children aren't the only people that matter in the equation. The pedophile matters too. Augustine helps us try to figure out how we can love people that are impossible to love. And the reason we can do that is because you and I are impossible to love too. It calls us to love them in hope, toward God, telling them the truth. Not just making space for them and going yeah, come on in. But saying, come in so we can tell you the truth about who you are, who God is, what the world is, and how you and I should live in this world. Again, like chapter 1, in freedom, which is as a disciplined community. That's how we show true companionship, by becoming true friends. So let me get to the last one. The last major argument is all about progress. Pro-argument. Hey, look. We have a problem. This is the pro-argument. The problem is this. You and I need our bodies. Now, this is the craziest one of the three arguments, but it's real. We need our bodies. Our bodies are garbage, as the argument goes. The reason why is because we get sick and die. So what we need to do is get to the place where we can use bodies if we want them, but we don't need bodies. So we can get our souls, although I wouldn't call them souls, I really call them the mind, out of the body. And to upload all of our consciousness onto the internet. Now, just to be clear, I know that there's movies about this. No, to answer your question, we cannot do this, and we probably never can. But that's the argument. So where do sex robots fit into this? Well, sex robots are the kinds of bodies we can one day inhabit, if we so desire, if we can ever figure out how to upload our consciousness. So we should use sex robots to experiment with the kinds of bodies we will one day have in the future. Which is crazy. So we just need to put all our resources into figuring out how to do that. What that looks like is we cut off all the kind of access to public goods and everything. We need to keep, starving people just need to die. We need to take all our resources, and sick people need to die. We need all our resources to figure out how to do this, because then humanity will be able to benefit. That's the pro side. The con side comes along and goes I'm sorry, that seems like it doesn't actually care about real people, 1. 2, who's going to be the kinds of people that make all this technology? Oh, I know, mostly poor, mostly women are going to create this kind of technology. Who's going to benefit from this technology? Oh, I know, mostly rich, mostly men. Cool. So that seems like it's a whole lot of progress. Augustine comes along and splits the middle like this. He says, the human problem, the human predicament is that we get sick and we die. And we do need the kinds of bodies that will last forever. But we should not have a benefit for some at the expense of others. So what we need is a good resurrection. Augustine gives hope for a day of the kind of progress that is better than anybody with any sex robot could ever imagine. A world in which you and I get the kinds of bodies we need to experience the kind of life that we've always desired. That's exactly what we get in the resurrection. So progress, absolutely, but not by way of sex robot, but by way of a resurrection. What does that lead to for the church? And this is where I want to close. It leads to patient hope. Augustine was radically agnostic about what God was doing in the world. He's like, I know there's a God, and I know that he's at work, but I don't know what he's doing. And so, because I don't know what he's doing, now I can live in patience. But it's a patience that's also hopeful because I do know what God is doing at the end of all time. So I don't have to know what God is doing right now. People ask me all the time, Jeremy, do you think sex robots are a good thing or a bad thing for society? And I say, yes, absolutely, both of them. I wish they didn't exist, but they do exist. And so because they exist, you and I are given the opportunity to live like Christians in a brand new way. Now, we don't actually do anything different, but the ways that we live are all of a sudden provocative. But as we do that, here's the thing that you've got to understand. It's incredibly powerful witness to the hope that we have in the gospel because, again, the sex robot functions like a relic of consumerism. It says, happiness can be yours right around the corner. And Christians go, I will not take for myself that which God has promised to give me in the resurrection. So I'll struggle. I'll be as free as I can possibly be. I'll be as friendly as I can possibly be. But I'll pursue the kind of progress that God desires for his people to pursue, which is waiting on him to give us everything we've ever wanted. So again, why take the time at New Zion to think about sexual intimacy? Hopefully this hour has helped you see the far limits of kind of human creativity and deviancy. To see that this kind of conversation on very practical levels and on very kind of, what mine was, kind of speculative levels, is a very important thing for Christians to think about. Because what we do with our bodies, sexually and otherwise, is a major way in which you and I live faithfully before God. Let me pray. God, thank you for this time and for these people and for this topic that is bizarre and kind of hard to wrap your mind around and not exactly typical Sunday school fodder. We hope and pray that you would make us the kinds of people that you long for us to be, to live freely in the world, to be truly friendly towards others, and to wait on the promises that you have given to us in your word, to give us the kinds of bodies we need to experience the kind of world that we've always wanted. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Meeks. And I'm asking everybody who has been live to go back and watch this teaching again, particularly through the lenses of what Dr. Meeks left us with in terms of loving people for God and toward God, and loving people who are impossible to love, just like us. So we're looking forward. We're going to continue this conversation. We're going to move forward. He's helped us to sort of frame our thinking, and more importantly, he's taken out some of the most difficult aspects of the conversation, so that in these next few weeks we're going to continue to move forward with the discussion. We're also entering into the season of Advent. I ask you to join us at 10 o'clock. Dr. Meeks will be preaching for us, as this is the first Sunday of Advent, and we're going into our little Advent series as it relates to preaching and teaching. As always, and thank you, Dr. Meeks, for reminding us that our bodies matter to God. So here's what I need you to do. Eat your colors, drink more water, move your body, and then at the appropriate time, I need you to lay your fat head down. We're looking forward to a great day of worship. Come and join us, and come back next week as we'll dive back into this topic and be as practical as well as theological as Dr. Meeks has been today. God bless you and have a great day.